Now that we've discussed some of the foundational concepts for phonemic awareness and phonics, concepts of print, phonemic awareness, we can move on to talking about phonics instruction. Now, phonics, in essence, is a teaching method that helps us teach learners the connection between sounds and letters in English. And we use this because we want to develop our learners' ability to sound out and decode new text by themselves. When learners understand how phonics works, they're able to read a totally new word without the teacher's help. Phonics is kind of like, I say teaching phonics is kind of like, you know, that old adage of you give someone a fish, you feed them for a day. You teach them to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. Well, phonics is like teaching them to fish. That gives them the reading skills to figure out words when we're not around. And that's really important. Now, before we move on, again, I want to make this distinction because sometimes people get confused. Phonics and phonemic awareness are not the same thing. Phonemic awareness is the ability to hear a word and recognize that that word is made of different sounds, as we just described. It has nothing to do with letters. Phonics, on the other hand, is a teaching method that lets us teach kids the connections between sounds in a word and letters. As I mentioned before, when we're teaching phonics, it's really important that students already are able to read Korean because they can use this knowledge to translate into a better understanding of English phonics. If they can read Korean, they'll be able to understand not just phonemic awareness, but understand how phonics works. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need to teach phonics. As I mentioned, students who learn phonics are better able to read. There's been a lot of research on this, and the research is pretty clear. Understanding of phonics principles helps learners become stronger readers. Again, because they are able to figure out words for themselves. Now, the other thing is that English, unlike Chinese, for example, is an alphabetic language. And because it's alphabetic, we can use that advantage. So rather than just memorizing random squiggles on the page, we're able to apply our knowledge of sounds and how alphabets work to help us read even better. Now, there's been a lot of research on this, and the research shows us that good readers don't bypass phonics. Even adult, strong readers, we still sound out words in our heads as we read. So we have this knowledge, this connection between sound and letters all the way through the reading process. And that's why the stronger that foundation is, the better you're able to read through the rest of your life. So when we get into the first stages of teaching phonics, of course, the foundation is the alphabet. Teaching the alphabet is the core, the first thing we want to do. Make sure students understand how the alphabet works, what the letters of the alphabet are. Not only is it helpful for spelling, but it's helpful for making those word, letter, sound connections as we go. And there's three kind of long-standing activities that are really helpful for teaching the alphabet. They're simple and they're efficient. They've been around because they work. The first one is the alphabet song. The alphabet song is great because it's catchy. Kids learn it, they can carry that around in their head, and that helps them to remember what the letters of the alphabet are. The second is alphabet books. Now we have an example of an alphabet book here. An alphabet book is simple. It's just a book, and maybe each page of the book, you'll have the letter, so maybe the letter C, and then you have lots of examples of words that start with that letter. As the child looks at the letter, they think about the connection between the sound that letter makes and each of those words. So C, K, cow, C, K, car. they're making all of those connections as they connect the pictures with the words, the first sound of the words with the letters. And this is why alphabet books can be helpful. Now, the last idea is this approach of using what's called the letter of the week. The letter of the week is as simple as it sounds. Every week, the teacher could choose 1 or 2 letters and focus on that letter. So every time we're reading a book together, reading a story, or we're talking about introducing new words, we can talk about, oh, hey, look at this. This letter starts with E. And what sound does E make? What are some other words that start with E? And again, we're making lots of connections across the week in various media, in various discussions. And the more connections, the more repetition we get, the better that builds the students' connections between the sound and the letter. So once we've talked about teaching the alphabet, we've used those methods, students have a good basis, they understand how the alphabet works, they understand what the letters of the alphabet are, we can get into actual phonics instruction. Now there are 4 methods for teaching phonics that I'll briefly go through. And the first is called the analytical or the implicit method for teaching phonics. Now this one's similar to the alphabet book that I just introduced a moment ago. This one works on the principle of giving students lots of examples of words that begin with the same sound of the alphabet. So my example here is the sound B, and we have blanket, balloon, banana, bee, boy, bat, ball. Give as many examples as possible. And those students look at those examples, and from all of the examples, they discern the pattern that the letter is connected with the first sound of that word. B, boy, B, bear, B, ball. And they figure that out for themselves. It's kind of an example of an inductive approach to teaching, where we give lots of examples and the students have to figure out the rule or understand what the pattern is in those examples. So this is the analytical approach to teaching phonics. The second approach is called the analogy approach. The analogy approach works kind of like this. It's based on the notion of word families. Now, an example of a word family here is the ake family, A-K-E. Cake, make, bake, take, and so on. When students know these word families, these little chunks of words, that helps them see the patterns and recognize more words at sight more easily. So rather than trying to figure out and use all that brain power to figure out the individual sounds, they can look at that chunk, that's an ake word. Make, bake, take, and from that they can extrapolate to learn and identify new words they might not have even been taught before. And so analogy is another useful and powerful method for teaching phonics. Teaching lots of examples of word families. The third one is particularly engaging, I believe, and particularly effective. And this is called the embedded method for teaching phonics. Now we can see here that this is based on, unlike the other methods we just discussed, this is about teaching phonics in a story, embedded in a context. So instead of individual words here, we have a story. Bug tugs a nut. He is in the mud. Bug goes to his hut. Now we can see here, through this story, we have lots of examples of a particular sound. So bug, tug, the sound. Now the sound, the U makes When we see this in a context, especially in an interesting and novel, unconventional story, that can be helpful for learners to remember what the word, what the sound is, through seeing it all these lots of different examples, and especially with the helpful visuals. Now, the thing about a story that makes it particularly powerful as a method for teaching phonics is, if we go back to the 3 theories, this is the theory that draws the most on interactive views of reading, because not only are they paying attention to the sounds in bug and nut and tug and mud, but they're also thinking about how these fit together to tell a story. And that's a top-down process. And again, as much as possible, we want to integrate top-down and bottom-up. So this is embedded phonics, teaching examples in the context of a story. Now, the last phonics teaching method is the one that many of us are familiar with ourselves from when we went to school. And this is the synthetic method. And in essence, the synthetic method is A says A, B says B, C says K. And when we say B, we add up A plus B plus C makes back, or whatever the word is. So we take the letters, we match them to the sound, we add up the letters, and we get a word. The very kind of traditional approach to teaching phonics. So the final method for teaching phonics is what's known as the synthetic method. And the synthetic method works by teaching the letter and teaching the sound that the letter says. So for example, C-A-T, C says K, A says A, T says T, C-A-T is cat, right? Making the connection between the letter and the sound, adding the letters up, and getting a word. It's the very traditional approach to teaching phonics, the one that many of us learned as students in school ourselves. And this method can be useful, especially in a Korean context, because Korean learners already come with a lot of knowledge about how the alphabet works. It can be an effective method. If we can compare phonics in English and then compare a similar word spelling in Korean, that can help make the connection for them. Ah, I see. Letters and sounds connect together in English, just like letters and sounds connect together in Korean. So they can draw on their knowledge of the first language. And again, in this regard, a synthetic method can be effective in a Korean context. Now we see here the April approach is based on a synthetic approach to teaching phonics. And because we are in a context where students have a lot of alphabet knowledge and phonemic awareness knowledge they develop through reading Hangul, they can apply all of that, and a synthetic method will work in this context. Now we've talked about phonics teaching methods. I want to briefly review the stages for actually teaching phonics. So what do we do first? What do we do next? And so on and so forth as we go through the process of teaching phonics. The first thing, as I mentioned early on, is phonemic awareness. Now, of course, along with phonemic awareness, we want to focus on concepts about print. Make sure learners understand how books work. But the first stage is phonemic awareness. Being able to separate the words, the sound of words into the various sounds those words make. And also being able to identify the initial sounds of the alphabet, right? When we talked about that alphabet book, and C connects to cat, and cow, and car, and crab, being able to identify that C at the beginning of that word makes a K sound is the first step in the phonics process. From there, we want to focus on rhymes. Now, rhymes are a syllable is broken into an onset and a rhyme. The onset is the first sound in the syllable. So cat is the onset, and rhyme, at, is the rhyme. And the next part we want to focus on are rhymes. So after we've taught the initial sound in the syllable, the initial sound in the alphabet, then we want to focus on the rhymes. So the second half, or word families. Rhymes are also like word families. After that, we want to introduce short vowels. And we see here some examples. The word hat, that's a short vowel. And then tub is another example. Usually short vowels can be found in 3-letter syllables. After we've taught short vowels, then we move on to making sure that students understand all the consonants in the alphabet. What sounds connect to all of those consonants in the alphabet? After we've made the consonants a solid connection, make sure learners understand what sounds the consonants make, we move on to long vowels. And a long vowel, the rule generally is a long vowel says its name. So in hate, the example here with hate, A says A, right? So that vowel is saying its name. That's a long vowel. So in the word kite, I is saying its name, again, a long vowel. After we've taught long vowels, we'll move on to what are called blends, or sometimes called consonant clusters. And an example of a consonant cluster is in the word stew. So stew is actually two sounds, two consonants, s and t. And those two sounds together are a consonant cluster. Another example of a consonant cluster would be the word strength. The STR in the beginning of the word strength is another example of a consonant cluster. So once we've finished teaching consonant clusters, we move on to digraphs. Now, sometimes people get confused between consonant clusters and digraphs, but a consonant cluster is a group of consonants with each of the individual sounds being made. So STR, those sounds are all made in that word. But a digraph is two consonants but only makes one sound. So in the word phone, so PH are two consonants, but it only makes one sound. So in that case, it's a digraph. So whenever we see two consonants together that only make one sound, that's a digraph. And the next we want, so after we've taught digraphs, and again, digraphs is probably one of the more tricky concepts for a learner to understand, especially in the case of Korean where there are no digraphs, one letter makes one sound. Once they've understood that, then the last piece of the puzzle is multisyllabic words or polysyllabic words, so words with more than one syllable. And so probably the most effective method for doing that is teaching students how to find little words inside of big words. So that's where we finish off, is with breaking down polysyllabic words. Now, April very much follows this method for teaching phonics. Single letter sounds, short and long vowels, and then double letter consonants, silent letters, vowels, and then finish off with R-controlled vowels. And it very much follows the typical research-based approach to teaching phonics.